Today's top story from the perspective of someone who's there.
You are looking live.
This just in.
Not my beat.
So I started my day today reading The Pulse, the daily newsletter from The Athletic, and there was a blurb about a piece that really intrigued me about draft strategy and why so many teams seemingly get it wrong. The piece was written by Alec Lewis. We immediately sent an email over to our friends at The Athletic, and lo and behold, ladies and gentlemen, Alec Lewis with us here on the show to discuss. Alec, thanks for your time, man. Great work on that piece. Really, really excited to talk to you about it. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, first, thank you guys for having me. I appreciate you reading The Pulse. I appreciate you waking up and reading a long story that in this day and age, it seems like all my friends are unwilling to read or seemingly getting there. I appreciate you having me and appreciate, it wasn't a mock draft, but I tried to give something, so thank you.
Yeah, no, that's the easy content piece this time of year. It's just, I talked to some folks. Here's a mock draft. No, you did this crazy thing called actual reporting. And the actual reporting leads you to some academic studies that first appeared in the early 2000s about draft strategy and some various characters in the story that read them and talked to teams and then watched those teams completely not listen to their advice. How did you, first of all, let's just start here. How did you stumble upon this story idea?
Yeah, another writer actually asked me that. Another of our writers at The Athletic asked me that like 2 hours ago. And I thought about it for a second. I'm like, I can't even really remember. I think what happened was, so I cover the Vikings day to day, and I've done I've done 2 seasons now. Before that, I covered Major League Baseball. And the first draft that I was kind of aware of with the Vikings, Kwesi Adofo-Mensah, the GM over here, traded down from, I think it was 12 to 32 or something like that, and the picks have not panned out, and people crush Kwesi kind of yearly about like the effectiveness of those picks. And so I think what happened was I was kind of curious, like, was it a dumb pick? Was that a dumb move? Was that a dumb strategy? Like, did he just miss on the picks? Is it normal to miss on picks? Like how? And then I read all the time these mock drafts, and editors make us write them, and I'm like, but do I really know? Do the teams really know? Like when it's a lot of rambling, but it just got me thinking a lot about the entire process in general. And I think it's kind of an under talked about thing. It's the only time in the NFL cycle where all 32 teams are actually competing against one another. And I found that like pretty fascinating, and the idea of it fascinating. And so while there have been a million stories written about like inside the draft room and what goes on, I just felt like it was worthwhile digging into like, is there really a way to figure out if this is random, and how random is it? And it led me down this really crazy path.
So we'll get to some of the conclusions on like why teams act the way they do in a second. But in terms of the data that you uncover, that folks have spent years researching, like what is, I love the headline and kind of the first graph that you have too. Basically, like NFL teams know what they're supposed to do and they can't help themselves. They don't do it. So what is it that they're supposed to do? What is actual good draft strategy as studied and proven time and time again by academic types?
Yeah, so the first question would be, why would academic types be interested in the draft? And I thought that was interesting unto itself. And the answer is, it's a pool of decision making, which is interesting for people to study, and it's also a pool of decision making within a market. So behavioral economics, who study the psychology and markets constantly, this is just a very easy data set to study. So that is partly why it's interesting. And for me, I mean, the easy takeaway from the research is that this is a very uncertain, random process, because you are not picking the player that you think's best right now. You are picking a player that you're projecting to be best 5 years from now. And when you actually replace one question with another, you realize it's impossible to predict anybody where they're going to be in 5 years. And so if it's such a random, uncertain process, the optimal approach would be, well, why don't we amass as many picks as possible, have as many darts to throw as possible, and at some point, if you throw a lot of darts, you'll probably hit a couple of them. And so that's really one of the main takeaways. The other is that trading picks now for picks in the future is an incredibly valuable and a sensible approach. But the problem is, unlike really the world and how we operate. If you were offered $100 today for $200 next year, you're probably taking the 200. For some reason, these NFL teams are unwilling to make that deal.
No, it is pretty wild. And I was just I think your piece was still super fresh on my mind. I was saying, like, if you're the Commanders, you have these two super valuable second round picks at 36 and 40. Would you, like, just for the sake of it, see if you could offer someone those two picks for a first next year and see if someone bit? Like, would you do something crazy like that? And especially if you do it to a team that might not be very good, could you wind up with a pick in the teens next year? Like, there's all kinds of things that you can do with this data set, and teams then seem to default to the things they've always done. Again, we'll get back to that in a second. I think the question then becomes, too, though, if the smart draft strategy is to accumulate as many picks as possible, that you do have to eventually use them. So how much of that got studied, and like what the actual good use of picks is besides turning them into more picks, whether now or in the future?
Well, it's a great point, and it's something that came up a lot because, I mean, obviously with the reporting, it's like, why don't teams do this more? But then what would be the arguments to doing so? And there are a few pretty obvious ones. The one you just mentioned is one of them. I mean, you have to fill out, I mean, part of it is you have to fill out a roster that has to have some really A-level, high-level players. Like, for this story, I talked to Bill Polian, former GM, who told me that, like, he felt that you always had to have, if you were going to be a Super Bowl winning caliber team, you had to have 12 A-level players. And the reality is the most optimal way to get those types of players are to pick them high in the draft, because that's where you find the most explosive players, the guys with the most potential. In free agency, it's less likely to find those types of guys, and through trade, it's less likely to find those types of guys. So at some point, you kind of have to have that amount of high-end draft capital. And then the other reasons I think that kind of speak against it is, like, if you're trading up to acquire a quarterback, the returns you can find on that type of player are potentially so transcendent. An example happened in Kansas City. You guys might know the guy's name over there, to where when you trade up and you're willing to allocate a lot of picks for that type of position, it's sensible to do that. And then I think other people refrain from doing this type of thing because of just a lot of different reasons. I mean, either it's their own personal, they're thinking for themselves and their own job security. They're thinking just in the idea of, like, what if they trade multiple times and pick a bunch of players and they don't work out, then the media will probably hammer them for it. So there's just so many dynamics that prevent teams from probably using the optimal strategy. And that part of it, to me, is maybe as interesting as anything else.
Yeah, Alec Lewis, staff writer for The Athletic, covers the Vikings day-to-day, but did a really cool piece studying the best draft strategies and why NFL teams don't ultimately use them. He's with us here on The Hoffman Show. I loved the part in the piece where you talked about how if you take 7 picks and turn it into 13, some GMs will look at that as 13 chances to be criticized versus 7, as opposed to 13 chances to be right. Maybe you even miss 5 of them. But if you go 8 for 13 versus 4 for 7, or even 5 for 7, you've got 8 good players instead of 5, even if the percentages aren't there. So it gets into, like, this very human thing. Why do you think that, like, what is the best guess as to why they do this and they don't actually follow the data, and why so many NFL people operate from a place seemingly of fear?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a great question. Like I said earlier in the conversation, I cover Major League Baseball, and so I think it colors a lot of how I view the NFL and analytics within the NFL and data usage and all that stuff, because baseball is just so far ahead. It just is. I mean, baseball, Moneyball, the book came out 2 decades ago. I mean, I did a story last year on biomechanics and quarterback development, which is just coming on. In baseball, it's been a thing with the Tampa Bay Rays and Dodgers since 2014. So I often think of it as like the NFL is 10 years behind. And so if you're behind, you're going to be like baseball, which for a long time was reticent to adopt a lot of new age pitching strategies and stuff that has helped teams like the Baltimore Orioles become what they've become in recent years. And so I think that's definitely part of it, just a lack of willingness to think forward. I mean, I also think one of the best quotes I thought in the story, it was essentially someone saying, like, people are often very unwilling to admit how arbitrary and random and how much variance exists in these sports. And because admitting that it's random or uncertain or has a lot of variance kind of takes away from the reason you were hired in the first place. And I just think it's kind of probably a comment that speaks to a lot of different industries and a lot of facets. But to me, I think that's another facet of the NFL. There's just a lot of ego and a lot of coaches, a lot of scouts unwilling to admit that they don't really know, because then what is their job really meant to be? And I didn't reference Sam Presti in the story, but I thought a lot just kind of in juxtaposition of the NFL. Like Sam Presti with the Oklahoma City Thunder has been willing to think long-term again and again and again and again. Now he's gone through 2 rebuilds and built 2 really high-level teams, and people don't really talk about him frequently for the team-building approach and that sustainability. I guess they will probably starting now, but it's always very interesting to me to kind of cross-pollinate different sports.
No doubt, and certainly we hope that a couple of his proteges and Michael Winger and Will Dawkins, who are running the Wizards, can repeat that here in D.C. on the basketball side. But I will say, Alec, reading your piece as someone who is emotionally invested in the Commanders, if I was a Commanders fan, truly, versus someone who covers them, whatever, someone who's rooting for the Commanders to do well, whether it's for personal or professional reasons, I would be, / I am, incredibly excited at what I read, because I look at Josh Harris, someone who has employed some of this thinking in the NBA with the Sixers, in the NHL with the Devils, who comes from a finance world where he thinks very differently than a lot of other NFL owners, and just generally is kind of, obviously he oversaw the process in the NBA. Like, how much opportunity is there for owners who, I think if you read the piece, I came away with, and I'm sure as the writer, you probably came away with this as well. Owners seem to drive a lot of this stuff in terms of the short-termism often, and empowering, or in terms of even who they hire, who might have their own internal short-term thinking versus the dictation from the top to be more long-term. And so if you're a Josh Harris, or if you want to highlight anyone else in the league, like, what kind of opportunity exists by zigging when every piece of available evidence says to zig, and yet most people are zagging?
Well, I'll give you 3 things. So someone said for me, and I don't think this is in the story, but someone said to me, having a competent / long-term oriented owner is the most competitive advantage in professional sports. So I thought that was a fascinating comment. It's something that I'll think about. So I guess to your question, like the owner, someone else said this to me too, like the owners that have the grit to do something different, and then even when it doesn't work out immediately, continue to stick with the process that ultimately might lead to the most gains in the long run, is an owner that it would just be shocking to kind of think about where things will fall. And someone else said to me, he's like, if you took this approach for a 6-year time horizon, and that's a crazy time horizon to give anybody within the NFL, because you don't have these jobs very long. But it said to me, like, if you were to take a lot of these processes for 6 years and just hammer them over and over and over, like, there's no telling how good or how deep your roster / number of assets might ultimately be. And so Josh Harris, I mean, it's a fascinating option example because of his experience in other sports. And I have to think that experience helps him. And you mentioned the finance background. You would think he would think very long-term oriented. But the thing I think I found reporting this piece is you have in a lot of cases, these owners have made money because of their wits in one regard or another. And so you would think they would be willing to think long-term, to think big picture, to stay disciplined. And yet, because of, as someone in the story said, like it's such an emotional playground with such high-dollar decisions that it creates such bizarre behavior. And so the hope, I think, you would be in Washington would be like, for as much as we believe in Josh Harris, like can he refrain from this in such an odd and wacky and messy environment that is the NFL?
Yeah, my answer for that is yes. I was talking to an executive with the team within the last couple of months, and basically the quote was, "This dude owns the Sixers. He wins 50 games a year, and everybody hates him. there's nothing Commanders fans can tell him that he hasn't heard before, and probably 10 times worse. He's kind of immune to the public pressure. Like, he just doesn't listen to it, doesn't care. He sticks to his guns. And I think that one of the most impressive quotes I've ever heard from a sports owner came from him at a symposium, I think late last year, which was basically, if you want to get to 8-8, I can get there real fast. There's a million shortcuts to 8-8. Winning over the long term is a lot harder, and there are no shortcuts to that. And I think of most teams, the Vikings, I think Kwesi has kind of a long-term view, at least it seems like that from afar. They obviously were able to get pretty quickly to being really good because they had really good players and did a good job. But I think a lot of teams in the NFL fall into that trap where they get to 8-8, they feel like they're one player away, and the reality is they're just stuck at 8-8, and that player is never coming. And so I think that, like, your reporting here just really emphasizes that point, that it's really easy to get to the middle. If you don't do the things that are proper for investment over the long term, you're never actually going to get to the top.
Yeah, and I mean, it's funny because the Vikings previous quarterback, Kirk Cousins, who was signed here to put them over the top and ultimately led them not much farther than the middle, was just signed by a lot of money by the Atlanta Falcons. And so the question would be, like, does that get them over the top just to the first round of the playoffs? And someone said to me, well, you act differently as an owner if you're 85 years old and you don't know if you have some long-term time horizon to watch your team try to compete for a 10-year span and build the best roster. So that dynamic of it is interesting too. It's like, if your owner is a different age, it might affect decision-making. The other thing is, like, if you have a really good quarterback or who's young, you might want to prove to them that you're going to give it everything you've got in the short term. So there are all these facets that, like, as I kind of started the call, they're not as sexy as talking about the mock draft, who the Commanders are probably going to pick in the third round. But to me, like, these are the things that guide the probabilities that the team you love has a chance of winning the championship that they covet. And so for me, it's this. I mean, the reporting of this for me was pretty formative, like, in probably how I'll view team building and just the idea of uncertainty and variance in general and bias really involved within it also. It's what made it so fun. It's why, I mean, I could have written the story probably 4 times as long with 700,000 anecdotes because it was that interesting for sure.
Yeah, no doubt. You might even say, like, I think this is probably a little harsh on Cousins, but it also might be true. He might be the ultimate shortcut to 8-8. Really, maybe it's the shortcut to, 10-7 now with the 17-game schedule. Like, maybe he's the ultimate shortcut to that. But that, in some ways, like, he's exactly what Harris is talking about versus hunting the Mahomes, the Josh Allen, etc. Okay, real quick before we let Alec Lewis go, last question for you, sir, is what the hell are the Vikings going to do here? They're maybe the most interesting team in the draft. I'll have you put your day job hat back on for a second. We know they have 11-23. What do you think they ultimately do 9 days from now in the first round of the draft?
Yeah, I thought you were going to ask me. I did a story on Jaden Daniels and how his processing developed through virtual reality technology, but you can get me back and have me on that another day.
Let's go ahead and, like, schedule for, I don't know, next Friday after they take him second, because I have read that one too, and it's really good. But for preview purposes, Vikings.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. Now, what I would say is the Vikings, I mean, they acquired the number 23 pick in the draft for maximum flexibility, but it seems pretty obvious that their preferred scenario is going to be to trade up to number 3, number 4, number 5, somewhere within that range to draft a quarterback. Now, the question ultimately becomes, what does the competition look like in terms of trying to trade into that spot, and how much risk are the Vikings willing to take on in terms of future potential first-round pick to acquire that type of player? I mean, that to me, those two things could be the buffer to going up and getting the guy they covet. But they've done a heck of a lot of work on this quarterback class. And if the first round ends and 11-23 go by and the Vikings have picked 2 players and one of them's not a quarterback, I'd be very, very surprised come next Thursday night.
Alec Lewis, you definitely got to check out his work in The Athletic. This piece, again, like, we just talked about it for 20 minutes. There's so much that we left on the table. Apparently, there's more somewhere on the cutting room floor that hopefully Alec puts into print in the future. But also definitely check out the Jaden Daniels virtual reality piece. Ton of great work. Alec, really appreciate your time, man. Hope we have, well, if they draft Daniels, we're going to have you back talk the virtual reality thing. But even without, hope we have an excuse to have you back on the show. This was great, man.
No, I appreciate you guys. Appreciate you guys having me. And thanks again for reading it. It's really I told an editor yesterday when we filed it and it was all set. I'm like, I don't know how many people are going to care about this, be interested in it, but it's I think team building in general and just thinking about team strategy overall is one of those things that at least a nerd like me finds interesting. So I appreciate you reading, pouring into it, and asking about it. Thank you guys, and enjoy this next week. Should be kind of a blast come Thursday night.
No doubt. If you want to write a nerdy piece, this is the radio show to come talk about it. Appreciate it, Alec. Thank you, man. Alec Lewis from The Athletic with us here on The Hoffman Show, a show for and by nerds. But we're cool nerds. Or something. And are you comfortable with that?
Sure.
I mean, my name's on the show. Ant's the cool part. I'm the nerd. That's going to wind up in a promo, isn't it?
Hey, this is DA, and you're listening to The Hoffman Show on the Team 980 and the Odyssey app.